Brad, a struggling taxi driver, discovers a wealthy businessman's wallet left behind in his cab. Despite his financial troubles, he makes the honest choice to return it, unaware that this simple act of integrity will alter the course of his life. It was late in the evening, and Brad, a taxi driver for over 10 years, was finishing up his shift. The city lights glowed faintly in the distance as he made his way through the quiet streets. He was exhausted, eager to head home to his wife, Sarah, and their 2 children. The weight of unpaid bills and looming rent was ever present in his mind, but tonight, he just wanted to rest. As Brad parked his taxi near a small diner for a quick coffee, he noticed something out of place on the back seat. A wallet, sleek and black, sitting there like a forgotten relic. Curious, he picked it up and flipped it open. Inside was a driver's license, credit cards, and a thick stack of bills, neatly folded. The name on the ID read Henry Callaway, and from the looks of it, this wasn't just any Henry. The man was a businessman, well off judging by the expensive leather wallet and the crisp, high-end suit in the ID photo. For a moment, Brad stared at the money. There was easily enough cash in there to cover his rent, maybe even some overdue utility bills. His hands trembled slightly as he counted it. $500, $600, $800, he muttered under his breath, his mind racing. His family needed the money. His daughter needed new shoes, and the fridge at home had been nearly empty for days. But then, something pulled at his conscience. Brad had always been raised to believe in honesty, no matter the cost. He let out a long sigh, knowing what he had to do. His shift had ended, but he couldn't just leave this. He needed to return it. Scrolling through the wallet, Brad found a business card tucked inside one of the pockets. Henry Callaway, CEO, Callaway Enterprises. There was a contact number beneath it. Without hesitation, Brad pulled out his phone and dialed the number. "Hello?" a stern voice answered. Brad cleared his throat. Mr. Callaway? My name's Brad. I'm a taxi driver, and I believe you left your wallet in my car." There was a brief pause on the other end. "My wallet? Oh God, yes. I must have left it there earlier. Thank you for calling me." Henry's voice softened, the relief evident in his tone. "No problem, sir. I can bring it to you now if you'd like. Where can I find you?" Brad asked, already starting his engine. "I'm at the Callaway building downtown. Can you make it here?" Brad glanced at his clock. His shift had ended over an hour ago, and Sarah was likely waiting for him at home, wondering why he was late. He bit his lip, feeling the weight of the decision, but his mind was made up. "I'll be there in about 30 minutes, Brad replied. The drive downtown was quiet, with only the soft hum of the engine and the occasional honking of a distant car filling the silence. Brad's thoughts wandered to his family. He imagined the smile on Sarah's face when he came home, telling her that even though they were struggling, he had done the right thing. When Brad finally arrived at the towering glass building, Henry was waiting outside under the soft glow of the streetlights. Dressed in a sleek suit, he looked every bit the successful businessman. As Brad stepped out of the car, he held the wallet out toward Henry. "Here it is, sir. Everything's inside," Brad said with a small smile. Henry looked at Brad, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you. I can't tell you how much this means to me," he said, flipping open the wallet and glancing at the cash still neatly in place. "You're a good man." Brad shrugged. "Just doing what I'd hoped someone would do for me." Henry reached into his wallet and pulled out a couple of $100 bills, holding them out to Brad. "Please take this, as a token of my appreciation." Brad looked at the money, hesitating for a moment. His family could use it, but something inside him held him back. "I appreciate the offer, sir, but I can't take it. I just wanted to make sure you got your wallet back." Henry smiled, impressed. "Not many would do what you've done today. I won't forget this, Brad." With a nod, Brad turned to leave. As he drove away, a sense of peace settled over him, though his future remained uncertain. He had done the right thing, but part of him wondered if it was enough. The following morning, Brad sat at the small kitchen table, sipping his coffee while Sarah prepared breakfast for their kids. The conversation from the previous night weighed heavily on his mind. He had returned Henry's wallet, refused the reward, and came home feeling proud of his decision. But now, in the light of day, With bills piled up on the counter and the sounds of his children laughing in the other room, doubt crept in. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked, turning from the stove. She noticed the distant look on his face, the way he absent-mindedly stared at the stack of bills. "You look worried." Brad forced a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just thinking about work." He didn't want to burden her with the details. She had enough on her plate, and he knew she trusted him to make the right choices for the family. But as he left the house for his shift at the taxi company, the gnawing feeling in his gut wouldn't go away. When he arrived at the taxi garage, his boss, Phil, was waiting for him near the dispatch office. Phil was a gruff man, always serious, and never one for small talk. As Brad walked up, he noticed a tense look on Phil's face. "Brad, we need to talk," Phil said, motioning for him to step into the office. Brad's heart sank. He hadn't done anything wrong, at least, nothing he was aware of. But he knew that look. Phil only pulled someone aside when there was trouble. Phil closed the door behind them and crossed his arms. "Look, I know you're one of the honest ones, Brad. That's why this is hard for me. You worked past your scheduled hours last night, and you know we've got strict company policies about that." Brad frowned. "Yeah, but it was just to return a wallet to a customer." "I thought—" Phil raised a hand, cutting him off. "Doesn't matter. Company rules are company rules. You're not supposed to be working outside your allotted hours. No exceptions. We're getting heat from management about overtime violations, and I can't ignore it." Brad stood there, stunned. He had broken the rules, yes, but for a good reason. Surely they could understand that? "So what are you saying, Phil?" Brad asked, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. Phil sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I've got no choice but to suspend you for a week. No pay." Brad's mind went blank. A week? With no pay? He could barely get by as it was, and now he'd be out of work for an entire week? The thought of Sarah's face when he told her, of his kids not understanding why they couldn't afford their usual treats, it was unbearable. Brad started, searching for the right words to explain himself, but Phil cut him off again. "I know you're a good guy, Brad. I don't doubt that. But the company doesn't care why you worked late. They just care that you did. I'm sorry, but my hands are tied. You can come back next week, but for now, you're off the schedule." With that, Phil opened the door, signaling the end of the conversation. Brad walked out, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath him. Everything felt surreal as he stepped back into the garage and towards his taxi. His mind raced. What was he going to tell Sarah? How could he explain that doing the right thing had cost him a week's worth of pay? Brad sat in the driver's seat of his cab, gripping the steering wheel tightly. For a brief moment, he regretted his decision. He could have kept the wallet, or at least taken the reward. No one would have known. His family needed that money more than Henry ever would. He glanced at his phone, considering calling Sarah and telling her everything right then and there. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. Not yet. As he sat there, he noticed a few of his fellow drivers gathering by the coffee stand outside. One of them, Mike, waved him over. "Hey, Brad. You all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Brad managed a weak smile and stepped out of the cab, joining them. "Just had a rough morning, that's all," he muttered. Mike raised an eyebrow. "Yeah? Well, I heard some buzz around here about you returning a lost wallet last night. That true?" Brad sighed. "Yeah. A guy left it in my cab. I drove across town to give it back to him." The other drivers exchanged glances, clearly impressed. "Man, that's noble of you," Mike said. "Most people would have kept the cash. You didn't take a penny?" Brad shook his head. "Didn't feel right. Guy offered me a reward, but I don't know. I couldn't take it." Mike chuckled, clapping Brad on the back. "You're a better man than me. I'd have taken that reward without a second thought." The other drivers laughed, but Brad's smile faded as Mike leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "Listen though, Brad. Word is Phil's gunning for you. Something about working off hours last night. You know how management is about that stuff. They don't care about the why, just the what." Brad nodded. "Yeah, I just found out. Phil suspended me for a week." The group fell silent. They all knew how rough it could be missing out on a week's pay in their line of work. Mike whistled low. "Damn, that's tough, man. Real tough." Brad just shrugged. It is what it is. But inside, he couldn't shake the frustration. Had he really made the right call? His family was going to suffer because he chose to do the honest thing. As he walked back to his cab, he couldn't help but wonder, what if he had just kept quiet? The drive home was quiet. Brad's mind raced with how he would explain everything to Sarah. His thoughts churned over what had happened with Phil and the weight of the suspension. Every streetlight that passed seemed to amplify his anxiety. He didn't know how to break the news without feeling like a failure. When he finally pulled into the driveway of their small home, the sight of his kids playing in the front yard, oblivious to the adult world of money and bills, only added to his guilt. He lingered in the car, gripping the steering wheel tightly, before finally forcing himself out. Sarah met him at the door, smiling despite the tiredness in her eyes. "You're home early," she remarked, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Everything okay?" Brad sighed, stepping inside and hanging up his jacket. "Yeah, no, not really," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. He glanced at her, feeling the weight of the conversation that was about to follow. Sarah frowned, sensing his tension. "What happened? Is it something with work?" Brad swallowed hard. "Yeah, something like that. Phil suspended me for a week. No pay." Sarah's face went pale, her smile quickly fading. "Suspended? Why? What did you do?" Brad felt the weight of it pressing down on him again. "Remember the wallet I told you about? The one I returned to the businessman last night?" He watched her nod, confusion in her eyes. "Well, apparently, because I worked past my shift to return it, I broke company policy. They're cracking down on overtime, and Phil didn't have a choice but to suspend me." Sarah stared at him for a long moment, trying to process everything. "But you were just trying to do the right thing," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "You didn't do anything wrong." "I know," Brad replied, his voice heavy with frustration, "but rules are rules. And now, we're out a week's pay." He glanced toward the stack of bills on the counter, the unpaid electricity notice sitting on top. "I should have taken the reward, Sarah. I had the chance, but I turned it down." Sarah's eyes softened. She stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "Brad, you did the right thing. I know this is tough, but we'll figure it out. We always do." Brad shook his head, still unconvinced. "Yeah, but at what cost? The kids, the bills, everything's piling up. And now this? I don't know how we're going to manage." Sarah took a deep breath, her own worry creeping into her expression, but she refused to let it show. "We'll manage because we always do," she repeated firmly, gripping his hand. "We'll tighten things up this week. Maybe we'll cut back on a few groceries, or I'll pick up an extra shift at the diner. We'll make it work. And besides," she added with a faint smile, "your honesty is worth more than any reward." Brad wanted to believe her, but the doubt lingered. He kissed her forehead gently, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him even as she tried to reassure him. "Thanks, Sarah," he said quietly. "I don't deserve you." The week dragged on painfully. With no work to fill his hours, Brad spent more time at home, helping out with the kids and watching Sarah take on extra shifts. Every time he saw her tired eyes and heard the low hum of concern in her voice, it made him feel like he had let them all down. One afternoon, as he was working on fixing a leak under the kitchen sink, his phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. Wiping his hands on a towel, he answered it hesitantly. "Hello? Brad? This is Henry Calloway," came the voice on the other end. It took Brad a second to register the name. "Mr. Calloway, right?" Brad said, surprised. "What can I do for you?" There was a brief pause. "I've been thinking a lot about what you did for me last week. It's not often you meet someone willing to go out of their way, especially when they're struggling themselves." Henry's tone was calm, but there was something deeper behind it, something thoughtful. "And I'm guessing the world didn't exactly reward you for your honesty, did it?" Brad hesitated. "Well, you know how it is. I don't regret doing the right thing, but let's just say it hasn't been easy." "I can imagine," Henry said, his voice thoughtful. "Listen, I don't want to pry into your life, but I've been in your shoes. There was a time when I had to make tough choices, and I know how hard it can be." Brad wasn't sure where the conversation was going, but before he could ask, Henry continued. "I've got an offer for you, Brad. I'm looking for someone trustworthy, someone I can count on. I need a driver, someone to be my personal chauffeur for my company. The pay is significantly better than what you're making now, and it's a full-time position." Brad blinked, the words hanging in the air like a lifeline. "You're offering me a job?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "Yes," Henry replied. "You showed me something rare, integrity. That's the kind of person I want on my team." Brad leaned back against the counter, processing the offer. The thought of stable pay, more hours, and being valued for who he was instead of just what he could do as a taxi driver, it was almost too good to be true. "What do you say?" Henry asked. Brad took a deep breath, glancing toward the living room where his children were playing quietly. Sarah was in the kitchen, preparing dinner after another long shift. He thought about the suspension, the uncertainty, and the struggles they've been facing. I don't know what to say, Mr. Calloway. This is a lot to take in," Brad stammered. Henry chuckled softly. "Take your time. Talk it over with your wife. If you're interested, let me know by tomorrow. I'll be waiting." After hanging up, Brad stood there for a moment, staring at the phone in his hand. His heart raced with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. Could this really be happening? That evening, as they sat down for dinner, Brad hesitated for a moment before telling Sarah about the phone call. Her eyes widened in shock, then softened with hope. "Brad, this is amazing. You deserve this. After everything that's happened, this could change everything for us." "But what if it's too good to be true?" Brad asked, still hesitant. "What if it's not what it seems?" Sarah reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "You have to take chances sometimes. You've always done the right thing, and now, maybe this is the universe's way of saying that it pays off. I think you should go for it." Brad looked into her eyes and saw the belief she had in him, the belief he often struggled to have in himself. Slowly, he nodded. "I'll call him tomorrow," Brad said, feeling a strange sense of hope rising in his chest. The next morning, Brad sat in the quiet kitchen, staring at the phone in his hand. The conversation with Henry Calloway from the day before played over and over in his mind. A new job, better pay, and the chance to provide for his family in a way he never thought possible. He could hardly believe it. The opportunity felt like a dream, but a part of him still feared it was too good to be true. He glanced over at Sarah, who was packing lunches for the kids before they left for school. Despite her exhaustion, she was smiling, humming a tune softly under her breath. Brad watched her for a moment, taking in her resilience, her strength. She had always believed in him, and now he needed to believe in himself. Taking a deep breath, Brad dialed Henry's number. "Brad." Henry answered after the first ring, his voice warm and friendly. "I'm glad to hear from you. Have you thought about my offer?" "Yeah, I have," Brad replied, his voice steady. "I've talked it over with my wife, and I'd like to accept the job." "Fantastic," Henry said, his enthusiasm palpable. "I'm sure this is going to be a great partnership. Can you come by my office this afternoon? We'll go over the details and get everything set up." Brad agreed, feeling a rush of excitement that he hadn't felt in a long time. After he hung up, Sarah walked over, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Well?" she asked, her eyes full of anticipation. "I took it," Brad said with a grin. "I start today." Sarah beamed, wrapping her arms around him in a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you, Brad. This is going to change everything for us." Later that afternoon, Brad arrived at the towering Calloway building downtown. As he walked through the revolving doors and into the sleek, modern lobby, he felt a surge of nerves. This world, the world of high-powered businessmen and luxury, it wasn't his. But he reminded himself why he was there. For his family, for their future. A receptionist greeted him and directed him to the top floor, where Henry's office was located. Brad took a deep breath as the elevator doors opened, revealing a wide hallway lined with expensive artwork and polished floors. At the end of the hall stood a large set of double doors, and through them, he could see Henry standing by the window, his back turned as he spoke into a phone. Henry waved Brad in as soon as he noticed him, finishing up his call quickly. "Brad, good to see you again," he said, striding over to shake his hand. "Welcome aboard." The office was even more impressive up close, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. Despite the luxury, Henry's demeanor was warm and approachable. He motioned for Brad to sit in one of the leather chairs opposite his desk. "I want to be clear about what I'm offering," Henry began. "This job is more than just driving me around. I need someone I can trust implicitly, someone who's reliable and, above all, honest. You've already proven that you're all of those things, Brad. That's why I'm hiring you." Brad nodded, still taking it all in. "I appreciate the opportunity, Mr. Calloway. I'll do my best." "I have no doubt about that," Henry said with a smile. "Now, the pay will be significantly better than what you were making as a taxi driver. Plus, you'll have benefits, health insurance for you and your family, paid vacation, the whole package." Brad could hardly believe what he was hearing. It was everything he had ever hoped for and more. "That sounds incredible," he managed to say, still processing the information. Henry leaned back in his chair, studying Brad for a moment. "You're not used to this kind of offer, are you?" Brad shook his head, laughing softly. "No, sir. This is new territory for me." "Well, you've earned it," Henry said firmly. "And I want you to feel comfortable here. We're going to be working closely together, and I need someone I can depend on. That's why I'm giving you more than just a job. I'm giving you a place on my team." The two men went over the details of the job, discussing the logistics of Brad's new role as Henry's personal chauffeur. Brad would be responsible for driving Henry to business meetings, social events, and occasionally running personal errands. In return, he'd have a steady salary, health benefits, and the security that came with a full-time position. After the meeting, Henry led Brad down to the garage, where a sleek black luxury car was parked. "This is your new ride," Henry said, patting the hood. "I'm trusting you with it. It's not just about getting from point A to point B, it's about reliability and trust. You keep this car in good shape, and I'll know you're taking care of business." Brad nodded, running a hand along the smooth surface of the car. "I'll take good care of it, sir." Henry smiled. "I know you will." Over the next few weeks, Brad settled into his new role with surprising ease. His days were filled with driving Henry to various meetings and events, but there was more to it than just transportation. Slowly, Brad found himself becoming part of Henry's inner circle. He wasn't just the driver anymore. He was a trusted confidant. One afternoon, after a particularly long day of back-to-back meetings, Henry asked Brad to join him for a coffee at a nearby cafe. It was the first time Henry had asked him to sit down like this, as equals, and Brad felt both honored and nervous. As they sipped their drinks, Henry leaned back in his chair, studying Brad thoughtfully. "You know, Brad, I've been in your position before," Henry said quietly. "I wasn't always this successful. There was a time when I was struggling to get by, just like you. But I made a few good choices, found the right people to trust, and eventually things turned around for me." Brad listened closely, surprised by how open Henry was being. "I see a lot of myself in you," Henry continued. "You've got that same fire, that same drive to do right by your family. That's why I hired you. Because I know how hard it can be to find people you can count on, especially in this world." Brad wasn't sure what to say. Henry's words struck a chord with him. He had never imagined that someone as successful as Henry could have once been in his shoes. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway," Brad said sincerely. "It means a lot to hear that from someone like you." Henry smiled faintly. "It's the truth. And I want you to know, Brad, this isn't just a job. If you ever need anything, advice, help, whatever, don't hesitate to come to me. We're in this together now." Brad nodded, feeling a sense of gratitude that went beyond words. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't alone in his struggles. He had someone in his corner, someone who believed in him. As they finished their coffee and prepared to leave, Brad felt a new sense of purpose. He wasn't just working for Henry. He was building a future, not only for himself but for his family. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the future seemed bright. Months had passed since Brad started working as Henry Calloway's chauffeur, and his life had changed in ways he never could have imagined. The steady income had eased the financial strain on his family, and the stability allowed him to breathe easier. Sarah no longer had to work extra shifts, and the kids were happier. Their lives no longer overshadowed by the constant worry about money. But beyond the financial relief, something else had blossomed. A deep bond between Brad and Henry. What had started as a simple employer-employee relationship had evolved into something much more. Henry often confided in Brad, sharing personal stories about his business, his life, and even his regrets. Brad, in return, became not just a chauffeur, but a trusted friend, someone Henry could rely on. One afternoon, as Brad drove Henry back from an important business meeting, Henry sat quietly in the back seat, looking out the window, lost in thought. Brad glanced at him through the rearview mirror, sensing something was on his mind. Normally, Henry was chatty after meetings, discussing the details and bouncing ideas off Brad. But today, he was unusually silent. "You all right back there, Mr. Calloway?" Brad asked cautiously, not wanting to intrude. Henry snapped out of his thoughts and smiled faintly. "Yeah, just thinking. These last few months have been a whirlwind." Brad nodded. He knew that Henry's company had been expanding rapidly, and with success came its own set of challenges. But something about Henry's expression seemed different, deeper, more personal. They pulled up to Henry's estate, the grand home standing proudly behind its ornate gates. As Brad parked the car, Henry remained seated for a moment, staring at the sprawling house in front of them. "Brad, can you come inside for a bit?" Henry asked, his tone unusually soft. "Of course," Brad replied, stepping out and following Henry into the house. The interior was as luxurious as ever, but today it felt quieter, almost hollow. They walked through the grand foyer and into the living room, where Henry gestured for Brad to sit. Once they were both seated, Henry took a deep breath. "There's something I need to talk to you about," Henry began, his eyes serious. "I haven't been feeling well lately. I've been keeping it to myself, but the truth is, I've been diagnosed with a serious illness." Brad's heart sank as the words hung in the air. "I'm sorry to hear that, Mr. Calloway. I had no idea." Henry waved off his sympathy. "I haven't told many people. I don't want it to become a thing that defines me, you know? But the doctors say it's progressing faster than they thought." The room fell into a heavy silence. Brad didn't know what to say. He had seen Henry as a pillar of strength, someone who always had control over his life and business. The idea that even Henry was vulnerable to something as inevitable as illness hit him hard. Henry leaned forward, his gaze intense. "I'm not afraid of dying, Brad. What scares me is leaving things unfinished. There are so many things I wish I'd done differently, so many people I didn't have time for. But in these last few months, being around you and your family, it's reminded me of what really matters." Brad swallowed hard, his chest tight. "Mr. Calloway, I don't know what to say." Just listen," Henry interrupted gently. "I've made arrangements for the company and my assets, but there's one thing I want to ask of you." He paused, searching Brad's eyes. "When the time comes, I want you to be the one to take me to the hospital for the final treatment." Brad was speechless, the weight of the request sinking in. It was more than just a job. It was a personal, intimate moment that Henry was asking him to share. Of course, Mr. Calloway. I'll be there. You can count on me," Brad said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Henry smiled faintly, a look of relief washing over his face. "I knew I could. You've been there for me, Brad, in more ways than you know." The days grew shorter as autumn set in, and with it, Henry's health began to decline rapidly. Brad could see the changes, the fatigue in Henry's eyes, the slower pace of his movements. But Henry never complained. He continued to run his business with the same determination, though he confided in Brad that he had started passing off more responsibilities to his team, preparing them for the inevitable. One evening, after another long day, Brad received a call from Henry's assistant. "Brad, Mr. Calloway has asked for you." "It's time." Brad's heart clenched. He had known this moment was coming, but nothing could truly prepare him for it. He grabbed his keys and rushed to Henry's estate, the cold evening air biting at his skin as he hurried inside. Henry was waiting for him in the living room, sitting quietly in his favorite chair. He looked frail, his once powerful frame now thinner, his skin pale. But his eyes were as sharp as ever. "Brad," Henry greeted him with a weak smile. "Thanks for coming." "Of course, Mr. Calloway," Brad replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Henry struggled to stand, and Brad quickly moved to help him. "Let's get you to the car." The drive to the hospital was quiet. Henry rested in the back seat, his eyes closed, his breathing slow. Brad could feel the gravity of the moment, the final ride. He glanced in the rearview mirror, watching Henry, his mind filled with memories of their conversations, their friendship, the unlikely bond they had formed. As they neared the hospital, Henry stirred, opening his eyes to look at Brad. "You know, Brad," he said softly, "meeting you changed my life. You reminded me that there are still good people in this world. Honest people." Brad felt his throat tighten, tears threatening to form. "I'm the one who should be thanking you, Mr. Calloway. You gave me and my family a future when we didn't have one." Henry smiled weakly. "Maybe we both gave each other something we needed." When they arrived at the hospital, Brad helped Henry out of the car and into a wheelchair that a nurse had brought out for him. Henry's hand gripped Brad's arm as they reached the entrance. "Thank you, Brad, for everything." Brad nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "Anytime, Mr. Calloway." With that, Henry was wheeled inside, and Brad watched him disappear down the long, sterile hallway, the weight of loss already beginning to settle in his chest. Henry passed away peacefully a few days later, surrounded by the few people he considered family. Brad was among them, standing quietly at Henry's bedside, holding the hand of the man who had changed his life in more ways than he could ever repay. The morning of Henry Calloway's funeral was overcast, a gray sky looming over the city. Brad stood by Sarah's side, holding her hand tightly as they approached the grand estate where the service was being held. It felt surreal. The man who had become not only his employer but also his friend was gone. The quiet grief that settled over the attendees reflected the deep respect everyone had for Henry. His influence and generosity were evident, not only through his success, but through the people who had come to pay their respects. Brad's mind drifted back to the final moments he shared with Henry, the conversations in the car, the quiet companionship they developed. He knew he owed so much to Henry, and as he looked around at the gathering of influential figures, he couldn't help but feel out of place among them. Yet, despite their different backgrounds, Brad knew Henry had seen something in him, a shared humanity. After the funeral, the attendees moved into Henry's mansion for a reception. The atmosphere was somber, with low murmurs of conversation and soft classical music playing in the background. As Brad stood quietly by the door, unsure of his place, a man in a suit approached him. "Brad, right?" the man said, offering his hand. "I'm Mr. Calloway's lawyer, Mr. Hamilton. I've been instructed to speak with you about something important." Brad shook his hand, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Of course," he said. "What's this about?" "Mr. Calloway left something for you," Mr. Hamilton replied. "There's a letter and, well, a few other things." A wave of disbelief washed over Brad. He hadn't expected anything. He had simply done his job, grateful for the opportunity Henry had given him. As Mr. Hamilton led him to a quiet room, Brad's heart pounded with curiosity and apprehension. Once inside, Mr. Hamilton handed him an envelope with his name on it, written in Henry's familiar handwriting. Brad's hands trembled slightly as he tore it open and began to read. "Dear Brad, if you're reading this, it means I've finally taken my last ride. I hope it was peaceful, just like you promised it would be. I'm writing this to thank you. You've been more than a driver to me. You've been a friend. When we first met, I saw a man who reminded me of myself, someone who put his family first, even when it wasn't easy. That's a rare thing these days. There are a few things I wanted to leave you. First, I want you to have my vintage car, the one you've been driving for the past few months. It's yours now, a small token of my gratitude. I trust you'll take good care of it, just like you've taken care of everything else. Second, I've set up a trust fund for your children. I know what it's like to worry about providing for the people you love, and I want you to have peace of mind. The fund will ensure that your kids can pursue whatever dreams they have without the burden of financial strain. Lastly, I want you to know that what you did that day, returning my wallet, was more than just a kind gesture. It was a reminder to me that integrity and decency still exist in this world. That act changed my view on people, and it reminded me that there's always hope, even in the most unexpected places. Take care of your family, Brad. Live honestly, and with the same heart you've shown me. With deepest gratitude, Henry Calloway. Brad felt a lump form in his throat as he folded the letter, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. He hadn't expected any of this. The car, the trust fund, Henry's words. It was overwhelming. Henry's generosity had reached far beyond what Brad could have imagined. Mr. Calloway also left the keys to the car in the garage, Mr. Hamilton said, handing Brad the keys to the sleek black car he had driven for months. And the paperwork for the trust fund has already been filed. Your family is secure, Brad. Brad nodded, still trying to process everything. Thank you, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. As he walked out of the room and back into the reception, Brad felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. Henry had given him more than a job. He had given him hope, trust, and a future. The weight that had once pressed down on Brad, the constant worry about bills and his family's well-being, seemed to lift. It was as if Henry had given him a final gift, freedom. Later that evening, after the reception had ended and the guests had left, Brad drove home in Henry's car. The streets were quiet, and the soft purr of the engine felt almost therapeutic. He glanced at the passenger seat, half expecting Henry to be sitting there, offering some wry piece of advice. But the seat was empty, and Brad smiled to himself, knowing that the memory of Henry would always ride with him. When he pulled into his driveway, Sarah was waiting for him on the porch, her eyes lighting up when she saw the car. Is this? Yeah, Brad replied, stepping out and jingling the keys. It's ours now. Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief. How? Brad handed her the letter from Henry, and as she read it, tears welled up in her eyes. She looked at him, her voice barely a whisper. Brad, this is incredible. I know, Brad said, his own emotions still raw. I didn't expect any of this. They stood there for a moment, both feeling the weight of Henry's final act of kindness. The trust fund, the car. It was more than they could have ever dreamed of. I think Henry wanted us to live the way we've always tried to, Brad said softly. With integrity, with hope. Sarah nodded, wiping away her tears. He believed in you, Brad, just like I do. Brad smiled, pulling her into his arms. I couldn't have done any of this without you. As they stood there, holding each other, Brad realized that Henry's gift wasn't just about the money or the car. It was about the reminder that doing the right thing, even when it's hard, is always worth it. And now, with their future secure and their family stronger than ever, Brad knew that they were ready to face whatever came next. Together.